Well, let me ask you about there were a couple of things you mentioned, and you didn't spend a lot of time on these in the book. And the only reason I want to ask you is because these pop up in popular conversations. One is Saturnalia. You talked a little bit about that, and Saturnalia mostly pops up around Christmas time when anti-Christmas Christians are trying to convince you that Christmas is pagan. But what just for people that don't know, you don't have to go in depth, but what is Saturnalia, or what was Saturnalia?
Yeah, Saturn is the god of the sun, and the Romans believed in this mythical ancient golden age, long, long ago, sort of when the earth was cooling. They believed that there was this golden age where you just frolicked in fields and you held hands, and there was no crime and there was no poverty, and everything was just really wonderful. And so Rome had this holiday that happened at Christmas time. It was obviously before Christmas because it's before Christianity, but it was a celebration. Rome had lots of holidays, lots of festivals.
Yeah.
They were always taking break from work to party. So they had like 2 or 3, sometimes 4 a month. And you'd take off several days. You'd be drinking. You would be partying, all the stuff. So Saturnalia was the biggest bash of the year. So think combining Halloween, the absurdity of Halloween, with the partying of Mardi Gras, with the patriotism of July 4th, with the gift giving of Christmas.
Like, think about awesome.
It was awesome. And it kept growing. It'd go from like 2 days to 3 days to 4 days to 5 days till it was over a week. And so it really it seems like it had 2 purposes other than to worship Saturn. One was to experience a sort of free society where everybody was equal. And so they would basically strip away the hierarchy of culture. So slaves could put on like a costume that looked like they were elites, and they could like tell off their masters. And sometimes masters would let their slaves eat at their table during Saturnalia. It was the only time of the year you're allowed to put up public mockery of the emperor or the senators. You could kind of, say, the emperor's an idiot or whatever. You had no rules about gambling. Children could gamble. Women could gamble. I mean, it was just complete frivolity.
Yeah.
And even some like statesmen just didn't like it, so they go off and like stay in a cabin for a week because they just didn't like.
They didn't want to hear the mockery.
Yeah, it'd be like living in New Orleans, during Mardi Gras, and just being like, I'm gonna go like somewhere else for the week. And so number one was just this frivolity, just absurdity. In fact, one ancient writer talks about turning the world upside down, which kind of is a play on this early Christian idea. But Saturnalia goes way back in Roman history. Secondly, though, and a lot of modern Roman historians have mentioned this, it was actually seen practically as a way to give slaves and the lower class something to look forward to during the year. Like, you would be beaten regularly if you were a slave. You'd be treated like dirt. But you knew for those few precious days a year, you got to live like kings, eat fancy food. Like, this was your chance to shine. But this was often seen as a deterrent for slave revolts. Like, if you felt like your slaves were getting antsy, you'd say, maybe we'll start Saturnalia a few hours early, or maybe we'll order a great feast for Saturnalia. The idea was, hey, okay. But some scholars have said this was a reminder that even though it was fun, it was complete chaos, and you can't actually live that way.
Right.
So an analog we have is. I don't know if you're a Hunger Games fan. Are you one of these Hunger Games people?
I've read the book through one time, but I never saw the movies or anything. But I have read all the books through.
Well, the world they live in it's all based on Rome, but it was called Panem. Yeah. And Panem actually comes from an ancient satire writer. He's what I call the Trevor Noah of the ancient world because he loved to do political satire. And so he had something. So he has this whole discourse on how the emperor abuses and keeps oppressed the populace. especially the lower classes, and he taxes the heck out of them. And he strictly enforces obedience with the Roman soldiers and with curfews and things like that. But he tricks them into liking him because every now and then he'll invite them for a free day at the Colosseum where commoners can come and sit in some of the best seats and have some free, Cracker Jacks and peanuts. And he lulls them into obedience through Panem bread and circenses.
Yeah.
Which is Juvenal's famous statement, which is picked up by Hunger Games. Hey, we're going to give them these games to help them forget that they are oppressed people living in poverty. Exactly. This is what Saturnalia was intended to do, I think, practically, was to keep the lower classes happy with a few days of partying, but then, and pretending you were equal, but then on the next day you return back to work and very much unequal.
Yeah, back to the real world.
Back to the real world.
It's a cool contrast to what you, at least in theory, would find in early churches, where when you entered, you did have slaves eating at the same table with praetorians or members of Caesar's household or whatever, and it didn't end. After a week, like it continued every time they met. It was ongoing. So you see, even something as debauched as Saturnalia, you can see what, like Lewis or Tolkien would call a fingerprint or an echo of the gospel in it. Like that, it's a longing for something, and it's just been distorted. And so the church would provide to a lot of people, the church would provide a compelling alternative. And would be, go ahead.
And there would be, I think it'd be hard for the early Christians to not fall back into stratification and hierarchy.
Right.
And we see that, for example, in the book of James, where James says, hey, when someone comes into your gathering, which would happen in a house, involve a meal usually, don't usher the rich people right up to the front and give them the cushy seats that recline with a drink holder, and don't take the poor people to the back and say, hey, you have to hide here in the dark. Nobody wants to talk to you. Nobody wants to see you because you're smelly and shabby. He says, you got to swap them. And you got to usher the poor right up to the front, give them the best seats in the house. And that tells us two things: that the apostles were serious about the ideals, but then there were Christians who were worldly, what we would call worldly, and syncretistic. They were trying to mix Christian ideas with Romanization. Yeah. And Paul says in 1 Corinthians 11, hey, you have this Lord's Supper, but guess what? It's actually looks more like the supper of the devil, you pagans. He's pretty hard on them. He says, some people show up early because you invite them early to have the best food, and some people show up late. They don't have any food because you're trying to show rivalries, and you're trying to show status and power. He says, if you're hungry, eat at home. Don't make these gatherings and opportunities to compete with one another. So we know that some Christians were not getting the message, but we also know that the apostles were insistent that they must live a different way.
Yeah, and that's where discipleship would have factored in, and like training and equipping. And I see it like, so having just come back from India, that's one of the things that churches in India have had to deal with and are continuing to deal with is the remnants of the caste system, where you will have higher caste Indian Christians being subtly, not overtly, but sometimes overtly, but being subtly treated or acting entitled to a little bit more than Christians from the lower caste system. And even though that was abolished and is technically illegal and everything, I mean, it's everywhere in the society. And so coming from a society that's one way to something that's like entirely opposite, which is what the gospel is in most cultures, you can see that there's going to be residuals.
It rears its ugly head.
Yeah, it really does. It's fascinating to see it in the ancient context, because then I think you can, at least I can better see examples of it in modern contexts. And so studying scripture and the history of, the context and the background, like your whole book. I mean, this is a great book for like I said, people that just don't know about the Roman background of Christianity or the gospel or how it would have landed in its world. And then the parallels, there's so many to our society today, which, I mean, people have argued ours is a society of bread and circuses. Ours is a society of people serving other gods. And, there's so much application. So I hope viewers watching this, I hope you guys, hop on Amazon or wherever. Is there a place that you get more of a kickback if they buy it from? Or does it really matter?
Not really.
When you're into this, really. I'm just trying to help my friends out, So
I appreciate that. People have so many kind of preferences and where they have, reward points and
right.
So reading it and buying it just means the world to me if people would read it. So wherever you want to read it, I think you might be able to buy it from Baker directly, but I'm not picky.
Well, as long as I'm going to put a link to it on Amazon. Folks, I definitely check it out. I want to ask you a couple more things.